Hello, my name is Vijay Prashad, the chief editor of Leftward Books. Today's Red Books Day, 21st of February 2021. We hold Red Books Day dear to us because on this day in 1848, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels published the Communist Manifesto, one of the most important books, not only in the tradition of the left, but of the 19th century, with an enduring appeal to this day. So happy today to talk with Professor Aijaz Ahmad, whose most recent book is Nothing Human is Alien to Me, where there is a brief reflection on the Communist Manifesto. Aijaz, welcome to Leftward Books.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Yes.
Well, in the first publication of Leftward Books about 20 years ago, our first publication was called A World to Win, Essays on the Communist Manifesto. You have a very important essay. Actually, I went back and read it again. So interesting and well, if the Communist Manifesto itself reads like it was written just yesterday, this essay reads as if it was written today. It's called The Communist Manifesto in Its Own Time and in Ours. In this text, you make the point that whereas, well, you say that the text was largely Karl Marx, so for brevity, let's just call it Marx's text. You say in this text that Marx not only wrote about the capitalism of his time, but because he understood the structure of what was happening, he anticipated a great deal of what was going to come next. Could you reflect a little bit, not on the clairvoyance of Karl Marx, but on the fact that he understood something of the structure of capitalism at such an early point in his career?
Actually, on this, Vijay, my view is that if you try to imagine that what he's saying about capitalism is about capitalism in his own time, you would be wrong. Capitalism was not very highly developed in the time of Karl Marx. The whole global production of steel in 1948 was 70,000 tons. That was, and most of it was in Britain. So it is not about capitalism of his time, but about capitalism as such, the logic of it. The one very important part of that is Marx's understanding of the sheer novelty of capitalism and how big a break it was from everything that existed before it. And so much of the text of the manifesto, particularly in the first part, is devoted so much to the exploits of the bourgeoisie, precisely in order to grasp what was really new and structural. That is one very fundamental fact, that for him, it is not a descriptive book. It is not a description of capitalism. It is a reflection on the logic of capitalism. And in that sense, here in this article and in some others that I have written, I have emphasized very much the philosophical engagement with it. And by philosophical, in his time, philosophy had not degenerated into the sort of technical things that it degenerated into. Philosophy was primarily reflection on history and motions of history. So that's one thing. The logic of capital, and in that, one, he is already in 1948, well before the work that he did on capital. He understands that very fundamentally that capitalism is essentially expanded reproduction. It does not reproduce itself in its The idea is not to maintain the status quo as it was the case in pre-capitalist societies, but it is actually expanded reproduction. That capitalism cannot survive without expanding, and expanding in various ways. The logic of which he grasped so well, that it is expanding the the sphere of industrial production itself, and therefore expanding the size of the proletariat. It is spatial expansion, because the market itself has to constantly expand, and national boundaries do not any longer can no longer contain the logic of capital. Therefore, it must go beyond national boundaries. That the increasing need for all kinds of raw materials, even food supplies of the kind that you need in 19th century urbanizing Europe, cannot be met within the resources of Europe. And therefore, colonization, imperialism is inherent to the logic. Now, of course, this is not a time when Marx has a whole theory of colonialism or imperialism, but the very centrality of that expansion. So colonialism, imperialism, all of them become a part of the logic of it. And then similarly, his understanding of in what way how the capitalist state is different from any former modes of governance or pre-capitalist states, if you want to call them that. So that and the intrinsic relationship between state structures and class struggles. That again, it is an engagement with Hegel and trying to think through and beyond Hegel's notion of the state and the bureaucracy as the universal class and so on. So it's very, very interesting how much of it is actually philosophical engagement. And at the same time, it is a text of its time politically. It is not a text of its time in terms of how he thinks of the structure of capitalism. He'll be engaged for the rest of his life trying to elaborate and work out the logic that is stated here in such a condensed fashion. It is political, it is a text of its own time in its political logic. And those logics are very interesting.
It's very interesting what you're talking about, because in a sense this is an argument for a kind of theoretical reflection on the structures of society, on production, on social life, and so on. And it's out of that theoretical reflection that Marx is able to, okay, maybe there are no laws as such in that rigid way of capitalism, but tendencies, dynamics, processes, he's able to identify these. In the middle of this, and it's extraordinary that this text simplifies things. It says that, on one side stands the bourgeoisie, and Marx in this text has a kind of ambivalence toward the bourgeoisie. It has a role to play. And on the other side, he says, stands the proletariat, this universal class. Of course, we're talking about 1848. There is both a philosophical understanding of this class called the proletariat. His friend Engels has already written a study, a brilliant study of the English working class, basically the life and labor of the working class in Manchester, one of my favorite books. So it's not that it's entirely a philosophical idea, the proletariat. It has tangible reality for Marx through his discussions with Engels. And yet, this is 1848 when the proletariat is barely developed as a class in history, and he's already theoretically conceptualized the proletariat as the universal class, the bearer of revolutionary processes in history. Reflect a little bit for us on the role of the proletariat in this text and then subsequently.
Yes. First, I think what you said about the proletariat barely, I think it's important to remember that at the time when he's writing, there are less than 500 trade unionists in the world. That's the size of the organized proletariat. On the other hand, the proletariat, European proletariat, is moving across national boundaries. And the text is written for the Communist League, which consists largely of German migrant labor. So the conception of these are the embryonic movements from which he deduces the future. This. All right, so that's one thing. But I also want to go back to the word proletariat itself. Engels makes it very clear again in his reflections again and again that by the proletariat at that point, they meant any number of things. Pure dispossession, not necessarily the proletariat that was engaged in factory production, but this immense proletarianization, as you might call it, the dispossession. Proletariat, in fact, meant even the lumpen proletariat was actually conceived of as a section of the proletariat which has fallen out of the main structures of the proletariat. Petty little businesses were, etc. When they spoke of the Paris proletariat, they were not factory workers. So one has to understand the flexibility of the term for them. However, at the same time, what he understands very interestingly is that the absolute center of new industry, new capitalism is industrial production. You referred to Engels' book on the working class, British working class. He has already come to the conception of an industrial revolution. So industrial production is at the heart of it. So the point is that for him, for Marx, the point is not how large numerically the proletariat is in his own time. Proletariat now in the sense of the factory, of the industrial proletariat. That it is at the center of proletarianization. This is where the center is. And secondly, that as industrial production itself grows, the proletariat is going to grow with it. And as the capitalist mode of production exceeds national boundaries, the internationalization of the proletariat will also grow accordingly. It's very interesting. He's very aware of the very many organizations, proletarian organizations in England, in France, and so on. And one of the things that are sometimes misunderstood about the manifesto is that line where he says communists do not form a political party, separate political party of their own. Uh, that again, if you read the manifesto closely, what is being said is that the proletariat is divided into so many different tendencies and so many different groups that making the Communist League the party of the proletariat would be a purely idealist assertion. What you actually want to do is to create a party of the whole, as they put it, as he put it, the party of the whole. And it is only when you have actually reached to that point where you can claim that it is the party of the whole that you can think of communists creating a party of their own, which in Europe that point was never reached until the 1880s. That one could discuss other aspects of the.
Well, there's something in this I wanted to ask you because, I went back and read the text again, the manifesto, and there is a kind of optimism. I don't agree with the view that says that there is a inevitability, that Marxist thinking suggests that there's an inevitability. I don't actually think it's there in the manifesto, but there is a great optimism. There is a sense, that this proletariat eventually, through its, the fact that it will use the technologies of the time, the telegraph, to create greater and greater unities. And there is that optimism that the proletariat will therefore lead the world into a kind of emancipation from capitalism. Um, how do you read, this sense of optimism in the text, and then in the Marxist tradition in general?
Yeah, there are many ways I think one could look at it. In dreams begin responsibilities. So that's one sort of explanation of that optimism. Uh, I think optimism of the kind that you're talking about, not inevitability, but optimism. I think in a very important way, it was very well founded. The fact is that just a couple of weeks after after the publication of the manifesto, a revolution did break out, and it enveloped what are now 13 countries in Europe. In France and Germany particularly, it was massive. So that optimism that this kind of possibility exists, and it's coming. That's one. The other is something that has been a feature unknown to Marx at that time, but as we look back, something that has remained a feature of communist politics and Marxist thinking is how to turn the national revolution into a class revolution. And 1848 already poses that question. As you remember, the revolutions of 1848, now people call it the spring of the peoples. This is a great moment of national uprisings in Europe. How does the proletariat intervene in what is actually taking shape, both as a democratic upsurge against monarchy, as well as, but the great fear is that it will become national chauvinist movement country by country. So that optimism is at the same time tied up with a very desire to create a political framework, both ideologically, intellectually, for clarification as to how to proceed. But that moment, can you grasp this moment? It's very much like Lenin's thesis on national liberation and so on, and what the formation of the communist parties and so on, that nationalism is real. The national question is real. And if you don't take hold of it, if you don't intervene in that process, you'll be sidelined by history. Your real choice is to compete with the bourgeoisie, defeat the bourgeoisie, take hold of the revolutionary movement as it is developing. It is in this sort of moment that both the optimism and the will to intervene really comes in. That optimism also leads them to great activity. I mean, Marx went to Germany and so on and so forth, and edited a magazine, to activism. So it is, we can change history if we engage with it. Kind of optimism.
This is a very important point, because I regard optimism, or what Ernst Bloch called the principle of hope, to be so integral to any action in the world. When I was in graduate school in the 1980s, this was the heyday of postmodernism, and you would always be challenged about teleological thinking and teleology and so on. And I understand, the philosophical objections to teleology. In other words, thinking that something will inevitably lead to something, or whatever, a thought that leads somewhere necessarily. I understood the problem with that, but I couldn't politically fathom how you would have an indeterminate relationship to the future and then yet sacrifice so much of your time trying to make the world a better place. It seemed to take away from people the possibility of action. That, of course, I'm very interested in how you have come to your thinking, and I mean, that's the whole point of Nothing Human is Alien to Me. It's a long conversation about the various phases of your thinking. So, well, the last question therefore has to return to that interest. When did you first read the Communist Manifesto?
Oh, I must have read it when I was first year college or something like that. Yeah.
And what kind of impact did it have on you?
Well, I read it at a time when, my whole sort of orientation already was sort of pink. I was not strictly already incorporated in the communist traditions, but and I was moving towards that, and I got my copy of the Communist Manifesto from a very eminent Marxist intellectual, communist intellectual, and so on. So it was that kind of impact, and it was not an impact only of the text, but struggling with the text in relation to discussions among people, among discussions with older communists and so on and so forth. It sort of blows your mind. It actually blows your mind in all kinds of ways. I was already, from what I recall, I was already very interested in the sheer power of the prose. It's one of the great stylistic achievements of the 19th century. It's a great book in prose. I'm sorry I can't read it in German. Hobsbawm says that none of the translations ever compare to the original German. So I wish.
Isn't that always the case? I mean, we're always told that kind of thing. I very much like the earliest translation where, the text is peopled with hobgoblins and so on. And I think it is a brilliant text. And you, of course, make that point in your essay, From a World to Win, where you say, you say that, well, it is one of the great stylistic achievements. And indeed it is. The breathlessness of description captures, in a sense, the sensibility of what he's trying to say. Isn't that what writers consistently try to do, is that the the content and the form should have a kind of unity. And it is one of those texts where the content, what he's trying to convey, is well conveyed in the style of the text. It's an incredible book. This leads me to believe, Aijaz, that we should do a series for leftward books where we discuss various texts of Marx. How about that? Should we do that?
Sure, sure. We should do that. Yeah,
Okay,
we can do
great.
it.
Well, thanks for coming to talk on Red Books Day about the manifesto. And perhaps what we'll do next is talk about the three great political texts as we come towards the 150th anniversary of the Paris Commune, which will be celebrated this year, 2021. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
See you.